Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of Gaudium at Spaz22.com, Podbean podcast, and YouTube video. Have two repeat victims of the podcast today. I'm very, very happy about that. We are going to be discussing today the new book by Dr. Daniel Mahoney. And Dr. Mahoney is professor emeritus at Assumption University in Massachusetts. I believe you're still also a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute, if that is correct. Author of numerous articles and books, but the latest book that we're going to be taking a look at is The Persistence of the Ideological Lie, the Totalitarian Impulse Then and Now. Here it is for those who are viewing. And I will put it in the show notes if I remember. I'm such a Luddite, I rarely remember. All right, but The Persistence of the Ideological Lie, the Totalitarian Impulse Then and Now. Daniel J. Mahoney, his latest book. Also joined today by a repeat victim of the podcast, Dr. Paul Seaton. Paul is retired from teaching at St. Mary's Seminary in Maryland, and he was the Michael and Barbara and Michael Fisher Chair, full professor while at St. Mary's, but since retired and moved to Wichita, Kansas, out in my neck of the woods. I'm from Nebraska, and so we sort of look down on Kansans, but we won't hold it against you. Actually, in Nebraska, the people we hold in most contempt are people from Iowa. I'm just going to say that it's Iowegians that we are not too fond
By
of.
the way,
Yeah.
when I was a boy in living in Southern Ohio, Lancaster, Ohio, the equivalent of those Polish and other jokes you weren't supposed to tell were West Virginian jokes. The French tell Belgian jokes, by the way, but they're the same exact jokes. So it's a kind of universal phenomenon.
Yeah, that's true. Or Eastern Kentucky. I have a friend from Western PA, Southwestern PA, Bedford, and he refers to the region he grew up as Pennsyltucky. Uh, since culturally it's more related to Eastern Kentucky, West Virginia, that kind of thing. Anyway, enough of that. Welcome to both Paul and Dan Mahoney. Thanks for coming on the podcast again here today. Uh, Paul very really did a great job. He did a really good job. Sent us a little summary of his reading of this text, and I was reading through it last night. Thought it was most excellent. So, Paul, hopefully you can play co-host here today and help me out with some of the questions. I read Dr. Mahoney's book, Flying to Rome. And I flew to Rome on April 25th, got home on May 23rd or 4th, something like that, to cover all the Pope stuff. And I have to say, reading about the ideological lie and its persistence of was put me in a mood to go to Europe, that's for sure. Because of all the political torment back here in the United States. Although the book applies to Europe as well. Let's get right to it then. Let's begin with the title, which is how Paul wisely begins in his little summary. Let's start with the persistence of the ideological. Now, Dan, you can start it any way you want to describe your own book. So don't let me lead you by the nose down paths you don't want to go. But I think we should begin by at least defining what we mean by ideology.
Yeah, no, I think that's very important. I do not mean by ideology simply perspectivism or a worldview. I mean that view, which I think is very problematic philosophically and theologically, the idea that everyone is simply operating from a rooted and limited perspective, and therefore all truth is perspectival,
Yeah.
limited, partial, etc. There's some truth to that, of course, but what it denies is the possibility of some kind of intellectual and spiritual ascent from partiality, from self-interest, from one's rooted perspective. Now, I'm using ideology the way some of the great philosophers and dissidents of the 20th century did. Ideology not as simply another point of view, but as a concerted effort at utopian social engineering
Yes.
and rooted in a really a denial of classical Christian anthropology. In other words, ideology roots evil, not in the imperfection of the human soul or heart, but in structural issues that have to do with in exploiting or domineering class or group or regime or social system. And that means that the drama of good and evil in the human heart is not the central moral drama of human history, but rather the localization of evil in certain suspect groups is the fundamental fact of human history, and therefore the great task of liberation or emancipation is to free human beings from the stranglehold of oppression. And I think this view is in many ways a corruption of a Christian or biblical understanding, but it's deeply anti-Christian at the same time because instead of calling us to point the sword inward, instead of calling us to repentance, Max Shaler once said, "Repentance is the most revolutionary force in the world, not utopia." Andre Malraux said, "I stopped being a ideologist when I realized that revolutions could not cure um, traffic accidents and unrequited love." In other words, the
Yeah.
fact of human mortality. So anyway, I do think that, I mean, to put it very simply, um, and because Rousseau is a much more complicated and complex thinker than his critics sometimes acknowledge, and Rousseau was not an advocate of Robespierre and terror, but Rousseau famously denied original sin. He denied that evil is somehow intrinsic to the human heart. Pierre Menant, in his latest book, Challenging Modern Atheism and Indifference, which is a book on Pascal's defense of the Christian proposition, does a
On my
beautiful
shelf. Yeah.
yeah. Draws a beautiful contrast between Pascal and Rousseau on original sin. And that's part of the equation, I think. But I would say this, rather than encouraging, recognizing ideological and utopian social engineering for what it is, as let's say Pope Benedict did so brilliantly in his encyclical Spe Salvi on genuine Christian hope, rather than discouraging thoughtful action, rather than discouraging a search and promotion of caritas and justice, it reminds us of the moral ecology in which human action unfolds. It reminds us of the virtues and vices that are central to lives well lived and collective lives well lived. So I see the critique of the ideological lie, which invariably leads to the institutionalization of massive mendacity and coercion and totalitarianism. I see it not as a giving up of hope, but a kind of recovery of the horizon in which the natural virtues flourish or have a fighting chance of flourishing, and where human beings place their hopes not in ephemeral, you know, ideological projects or revolutionary projects, but place them in, the transcendent, the ultimately transcendent source of hope. So, I've made regular reference here, if you've noticed, to the relationship between the ideological lie and the Christian responses to it. And I've done that because I think while the Catholic Church was arguably the most lucid and compelling critic of totalitarianism in the 20th century, and actually had a very, very good record in, just think of those great papal encyclicals, Divini Redemptoris and Mit Brenniger Sorga and all that. The church was spot on about the totalitarian evil, but I think we've forgotten some of that. And there's always a danger that the quest for justice, perfect justice, can become the enemy of the good. So I think it's really important to recover an understanding of the perversity of the ideological lie, both so we don't forget the massive moral and political lessons of the 20th century, but also because, as the book makes clear, we've seen new instantiations of the ideological lie in the form of a certain kind of progressivism, a certain kind of liberationism, wokeness. And again, two central features that I emphasize right from the get-go in the book. One is the localization of evil in certain suspect groups, as opposed to being constitutive of every human heart and soul. And the second, I think this is really vital. I think with the modern ideologies, one sees the displacement of the perennial distinction between good and evil, the age-old distinction between good and evil, with a fatuous distinction between progress and reaction. And once you say certain people on the right side of history and other people are not on the right side of history, you have an invitation to clearing away those obstacles to the transformation of society. I think that's very, very dangerous. And it's one reason, for example, when Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict as Cardinal Ratzinger, issued his instruction on liberation theology in 1985, he did so not to defend every existing political order, social order in Latin America and elsewhere, but to say that the fight for, genuine justice and the fight for human rights and the criticism of tyranny cannot be rooted in premises that will lead to worse tyrannies, and that will replace an authentic Christian ideology with a form of the lie.
Very good. Before I go on to my next question, Paul, do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, I've been talking with Dan, reading his stuff for decades, and so I've, you know, gotten pretty good at kind of distilling stuff. So I'll just say, he gave a very nice overview. We can go back and look at each and every part of it, including the kind of concluding caveat Christiani one. But seems to me the ideology has an intellectual, a moral, and a spiritual dimension or component. So intellectual, it corrupts the intellect. Moral, it perverts the moral order, which Dan you referred to quite a lot, and then it ruins our spiritual lives. And Dan has, he's extremely wide read, but he's picked out one or two authors on each of those dimensions. And then he's devoted chapters in the book to, the intellectual perversion of ideology. And that's chiefly Solzhenitsyn, but not nearly only Solzhenitsyn. But Solzhenitsyn is the one who said that ideology, it claims to be the truth about everything and it falsifies everything. So that's
Yeah.
the great paradox of it. And then morally, it claims to advance and fight for justice, but it perverts every moral value and virtue there is with, cruelty and terror, camps, etc. And then spiritually, Dan particularly likes Dostoevsky. And Dostoevsky and his demons or devils, Dan thinks really is probably the single most penetrating analyst of the spiritual labyrinth and the spiritual pathologies at work in the totalitarian impulse and the ideological mind. So intellect, the moral order, and then the spiritual order. And the last one really does nicely, I think, connect with, its aping of Christianity, its temptation to Christians, and the great need that Christians, theologians, and ordinary Christians need to be able to recognize it and then to resist it, because all the things that it corrupts, one of them is Christianity itself.
Dan, do you want to piggyback on that?
Yeah, I think that everything that Paul said is exactly on mark. I would say that the well, let me mention Dostoevsky for a second because it is absolutely the case that I consider demons, which was translated many, many years ago, a century ago by or more by Constant Garnett with the title "Possessed." But the Russian word is biesi. It's devils. It's not that they're possessed by devils, but they are, in some sense, have become vehicles for the demonic, like. One of the central images and the demons is the book begins with a quote a citation of the Gospel of Luke on the Gadarene swine, driving that herd of pigs off the cliff. What Dostoevsky saw was that moral nihilism, or the denial of the structure of reality, the nature of the human soul, the drama of good and evil in every human heart, went hand in hand with revolutionary terror and ideological fanaticism. He saw it before the phenomena had fully revealed itself. Although, in fairness, he had belonged to certain revolutionary circles in St. Petersburg in the 1840s, and he was appalled eventually by what he saw. What he saw was a denial of all moral standards, a denial of the very, he saw what Vladimir Soloviev later saw, this falsification of the good, where people talk nonstop about justice and liberation and all this, but as Alan Besson liked to say, they were using homonyms. They were denuding justice of the qualities of justice. They were severing human virtue from efforts to improve the human condition. They were, and Dostoevsky is not only the great and enduring critic of ideological fanaticism, he's also the greatest critic of moral nihilism. And he predicted if these nihilists, with their contempt for the old verities, their contempt for um, any kind of spiritual rendering, deeply spiritual rendering of the human condition, he says it will lead to 100 million corpses. There's a character, Shigalyo, a very frightening nihilist, revolutionary, fanatic, totalitarian in the devils, who speaks about the need for a kind of war on human excellence. And he says, when we come to the forefront, we shall we shall cut off Cicero's tongue, and we shall poke out Shakespeare's eyes. And this idea that somehow the natural order of things, with all of its imperfections, is somehow the obstacle to the fulfillment of genuine human liberation. So what Dostoevsky saw was behind the glittering phrases and the promises of emancipation was a cult of destruction, a cult of repudiation and negation. And in my book, I try to tie those two moments together. The one hand, the ideological affirmation of a alternative reality, but at the same time, the road to that alternative reality uh, is paved by a repudiation of the moral drama of human life that I've already referred to, but it's also paved by a kind of zeal for destruction. The idea that destroying the real will become the pathway toward the flourishing of humanity, and that is really one of the biggest lies of all.
Yeah.
So Dostoevsky saw, Solzhenitsyn says somewhere that the man could see. He just had that capacity to hone in on the fundamental realities. And by the way, that's a point. I haven't read the book in a little while, but I was very struck the couple of times I've read Father de Lubac's or Cardinal de Lubac's drama of atheistic humanism. He saw Dostoevsky as the great alternative both to Marxian,
Nietzsche.
yeah, Marxian delusions and Nietzschean willfulness, And Nietzsche, well, oddly, had a certain admiration for Dostoevsky as a psychologist, but also understood him as a kind of enemy, because
Yeah.
he remained committed to a certain understanding of Christ and a certain understanding of the moral life that was antithetic to the Ubermensch and the Nietzschean path. Nietzsche in his own way celebrated cruelty, a different kind of cruelty than the Marxists celebrated. Marxists celebrated in the name of necessity. Nietzsche celebrated it in the name of a kind of spiritual self-overcoming. So yeah, Dostoevsky is awfully important. By the way, Dostoevsky had some problematic political judgments. If you read his writer's diary, he didn't seem to like Poles and Catholics. He was not in favor of, kind of nasty, murderous anti-Semitism, but he regularly called Jews Yids and that kind of thing. But on the things that really matter, in other words, Dostoevsky was eminently cancelable if you wanted to go down that silly road. But if you look at the things that really matter, he saw he saw what Solzhenitsyn quotes it in the Nobel lecture, the tyranny of progressive little notions. He saw how enlightenment, progress, emancipation could become new traps. They could become, roads to servitude, spiritual and political. And Solzhenitsyn is, I think, more sober than Dostoevsky, less prone toward sort of messianic effusions about the Russian soul. But in essential respects, his recovery of the essential truth that the line between good and evil runs not through nation, party, revolution, etc., but through every human heart. And Solzhenitsyn says, right in the middle of the Gulag Archipelago, in the section called The Soul and Barbed Wire, it's possible for human beings to constrict evil within ourselves, individually and collectively. But when we try to abolish evil, we really end up abolishing the evildoers, who are not simply the evildoers, or just other humans like us. And then we amplify it in awful satanic ways. And that's the great paradox. The Christian does not aim to expunge evil from the world to core. He instead aims to limit it within himself. So again, the pointing the sword
Yeah.
inward rather than pointing the sword outward in some ideological crusade of repudiation and transformation.
Paul, you wanted to say something earlier?
Yeah, I'm listening with attention. I'm also trying to hear it as maybe the viewer or the listener who hasn't read the book or hasn't been talking with Dan about these things for 40, 45 years, how he or she might be hearing it. So I just want to go back to two elements of what Dan said about Dostoevsky, because I'm sure a number of viewers or listeners have said, well, ideology perverts, but what's the core that gets perverted? Is there something in there that's, good or defensible? And with respect to Dostoevsky, Dan said, look, you've got basically two kinds of revolutionary nihilists that are portrayed in The Devils. And one of them, the first group, they are attached to the modern notion of autonomy. And they push it to the extreme, which means we cannot be embedded in anything around us, above us, that limits us. And we also can't handle any imperfection or any slowness. So you've got the value of autonomy that goes haywire, and therefore it has to repudiate the real, whether it be contingently imperfect or structurally, hierarchical. And then the ideological revolutionaries, they latch on to equality. And I think there is, where we connect with things that are more familiar, say, to Americans or to readers of Tocqueville, people who know that, modern life, modern thought says human beings are equal, but kind of underdevelops the content of that. Or at most it says it's, natural rights or maybe even human rights. And then we look around, there's a lot of inequalities, a lot of inequities, and theoretically and practically, we don't know how to handle them. And so the ideologists say, damn it or darn it, I'm going to make equality real. And okay, so I think Dostoevsky did penetrate to those, I'm going to say, two modern values gone haywire. And then he just shows how they corrode the soul and how they are, to speak euphemistically, very counterproductive.
It's very interesting. Dostoevsky was a kind of populist, maybe even exaggeratedly so, because he had a certain confidence. And by the way, it's a very old story. He thought the average Russian muzhik who he met in prison had more good sense and more piety, despite sometimes being brutal and drunk, than all the intellectuals he had met. As the great Gary Saul Morrison has stressed repeatedly in a series of wonderful books and articles, the intelligentsia in Russia, which Dostoevsky revolted against, as did Solzhenitsyn, he called them the smatterers. They were people with a smattering of learning and a smattering of ideological cliches who had very little wisdom and whose thought led to destructiveness. But in any case, an intelligent member of the intelligentsia in Russia, and I think in France too, after the revolution, they were not smart people. They were not philosophers. They were not the wise. Dostoevsky, Chekhov, Tolstoy were not intelligents because, well, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy believed in God. They were opposed to scientism, reductionism, and materialism. Dostoevsky's work is as much a defense of the soul and human freedom and moral agency and a critique of scientific reductionism, utilitarianism. He wrote about the Crystal Palace in London in 1864, this celebration of science as solving all our problems, the explaining away of the soul. Those were vitally important themes for Dostoevsky. And he saw therefore, he saw a connection, you might say, between a kind of Western notion of progress that might not have been tied explicitly or emphatically to moral nihilism or political totalitarianism and a full-scale ideology. And something Dostoevsky saw, and it's also a theme that Solzhenitsyn picked up very lucidly, is that there's a question: why so many men and women informed by Enlightenment categories, by a certain faith in progress? Why were they so naive and apologetic for full-scale uh, ideological madness? Why did they adopt an attitude of pas d'ennemi à gauche, no enemies to the left? It was the curse of Russian liberalism, the inability to condemn revolutionary terror and outright moral nihilism. Why were so many prominent intellectuals in the Western world, including America, apologetic for the terrible crimes of communist regimes in the 20th century? This is something that Dostoevsky, Soloviev, Solzhenitsyn, they all saw very deeply. They saw that the premises of philosophical modernity, it's materialism, it's explaining a well of the soul. And as Paul emphasized, the affirmation of autonomy. Once you've affirmed human autonomy as the central truth of the human condition, it's very hard to resist the full-scale radicalization of that claim. What's the full-scale radicalization of that claim? It's the self-deification of man. And Earl Colney, another Central European anti-totalitarian figure, a convert to Catholicism, once wrote, "The self-deification of man is coextensive with his self-enslavement." That was said in many different ways by all the great anti-totalitarian figures. So we have to be very careful not to confuse um, sympathy and support for some of the achievements of modern civilization, constitutional democracy, you know, a bigger economic pie that allows us to get rid of the most abject forms of poverty.
This is,
Um,
I'm going to interrupt. This is an important point because I don't want listeners to think, oh, we're just all a bunch of right-wing, paleo-conservative, anarcho-capitalist type guys who are sitting here saying that ideology is unique to only to sort of leftist causes, when there can be materialistic and reductive and scientific presumptions even in right-wing populism. You see this increasingly with a sort of Darwinian dog eat dog mentality creeping into the post-Christian right. The theologian David Dean says, if we're afraid of the post-Christian left, just wait till you see the post-Christian right. And so I think this is an important point. You're not arguing against things like welfare state. This is not a wholesale just sort of denunciation of social programs or social justice or
oh,
these
no, no,
sorts of things.
far from it,
So go ahead. Yeah, I
what
want you to get that out there. Yeah.
what to guide all those things, of course, is prudence, and that means, I think sometimes the contemporary church, will talk about the preferential option for the poor, and it assumes a certain approach to political economy or politics is the best way to help the poor, and
Right.
a lot of terrible crimes were committed in the 20th century in the name of the poor. We've lost, I think, some of that invigorating tension in the biblical understanding of the poor and the poor in spirit. The poor as a sociological category can be rapacious and cruel, and terrible things can be done in their name. But the poor in spirit who are open to the saving grace and hope of God, another story altogether. But no, ideology, you're right. It can take right-wing forms. Nazi National Socialism, of course, whether it was not right-wing in a traditional conservative sense, it was a revolution of nihilism. But yeah, and I don't think it's the dominant current on the contemporary right, but there are certainly some people on what's called the new right today who are, I think, attracted to paganism and self-assertion. The alternative to radical feminist critiques of toxic masculinity is a true understanding of man and woman. And a
Yeah.
true understanding of man and woman, the Christian tradition, the classical tradition never endorse the right of patriarchal men to be rapacious and to rape and to domineer. It was about gentlemanlyship. It was about the complementarity of men and women. It was about stewardship and care. And so when you have, silly people running around calling for a restoration of the old days, and the old days are exactly what is misdefined by the radical ideologues. So, and we certainly don't want uh, Marxist cruelty to be succeeded by Nietzschean cruelty. We want to recover the sanity of a Christian anthropology, the sanity of the best of the liberal and modern traditions. But I think what has to be admitted, and the church was very good on this, even when it was imprudent in its approach to modern civilization and modern progress. Let's say some of the 19th century popes, was that the church understood there was a certain connection, to come back to Paul's point about autonomy, between the utilitarianism and naturalism of a certain kind of liberalism. They ignored other currents of liberalism, I think, that were more healthy and more in continuity with the older wisdom, and full-blown materialism, nihilism, totalitarianism, etc. So, um, and I do think what distinguishes the left and the right, and I don't mean this in a partisan American sense, is um, conservative doctrines rooted in classical and Christian wisdom at least have the benefit of respecting two things in principle: a politics of prudence, meaning not calculation, but high moral prudence as a repository of civilizational wisdom. And the other thing is the Imago Dei. You know, I think modern popes, beginning with Leo the 13th, and I think it was Pius the 12th, right at the end of the Second World War, gave an allocution in Rome on Christian democracy, and he said, "Look, the experience of recent times makes Catholics need to think more seriously about democracy as a means of protecting human dignity and protect and checking the rapacious misuse of power, the neo-pagan state." So all that is vital. I mean, what I find so interesting about the broadly political perspective of popes like Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI, they were completely misunderstood. They were not declaring war on the modern world. They
Right.
were they were engaged in a kind of dialectic recovery of old wisdom to aid and support the cause of liberty and human dignity in the modern world. And it's funny, whenever you have an understanding of man, an understanding of the human condition, a broadly political approach that's dialectical, that doesn't succumb facilely to extremes or to terrible simplifications. People misunderstand it. The ideological project, of locating evil in certain groups, if we eliminate them, we abolish humanity, there's no more need for transcendental hubs. That's easy. That's easy to figure out, and it's easy to imitate. But the demanding wisdom that, there's good things in modernity up to a point. In my book, I constantly take aim. Paul noted in his notes, I regularly refer to Roger Scruton, who's a very humane, civilized conservative, to his critique of the unremitting culture of repudiation. Uh, uh, but I also regularly refer to Eric Voegelin's critique of modernity without restraint. And I think that's a really important notion because um, uh, on both the theoretical level and the practical level, we don't want or need some just absolute sweeping critique of the modern world. That would be ungenerous and unjust. But I think the best wisdom, some of it conservative, some of it Christian, some of it simply anti-totalitarian and philosophical, has been alert. We're going to safeguard the moral foundations of democracy, if we're going to defend the remnant of Western civilization. That's an interesting question. How Western modern man hardly even thinks of himself as Western man anymore. The old idea of the
Yeah.
West, which was a great mediator between the best and modernity and the continuity of civilization, is almost gone. But our task is not to be, unilateral critics of modernity. It's to bring my late friend, the political theorist Wilson Carey McWilliams, who was a Calvinist, but he used to say, the task for today is to bring old gods to a new city. We live in the modern world. And the modern world has provided. My grandmother was living as a peasant in Ireland, when she came to the United States in 1905. She never went back because America was a land of hope, and Ireland was a place of without much hope in those days. So I think the critique of ideology is also, or the critique of ideological mendacity is also part of an effort to redeem the modern promise by saving it from itself. And what do I mean by itself? The ideological lie, the cult of autonomy, the replacement of the drama of good and evil with the illusory distinction between progress and reaction. These are all deformations of the modern promise. And so, again, our job is not primarily to be partisans of modernity either. It's to defend the truth about man, to defend liberty and human dignity in modern circumstances, but to resist reaction as much as we resist revolution. And that entails, that I think, a recovery of classical Christian anthropology, but it also entails a recovery of sobriety. And sobriety doesn't mean hopelessness, but an affirmation of limits, salutary, natural limits, is, and that in the biotechnological realm, Pope Leo's talking about, AI. I hope he just doesn't concentrate on the economic consequences of AI, enhanced unemployment or something like that.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
It's primarily an anthrop. Everyone misreads Rerum Novarum as if the first of the Catholic social encyclicals was just about the social question narrowly understood. No, it was much broader than that, and Leo's approach to AI has to be much broader than that. So yeah, no, I'm glad you emphasized that, Larry. We don't we This is not, we stand athwart history, say no. This is defend human dignity by resisting what Vladimir Soloviev called the falsification of the good.
Absolutely.
Modernity
Yeah.
without restraint is a terrible danger and a terrible temptation.
Yes, I mean, and I'll turn it over to Paul in a second, but I wanted to say that, yeah, described in those terms, I would describe myself obviously as conservative as well. I have many more progressive liberal Catholic friends who are always puzzled by my commitment to Dorothy Day and all this, and her critique of capitalism and war and so forth, and yet I still describe. I think Dorothy had fundamental conservative impulses as well when you really unpack her theology and her worldview. All that being said, I think, yeah, I hope Pope Leo doesn't just concentrate on the economics of AI, because coming from this more conservative critique, the danger of AI isn't just about displaced jobs. The danger of AI is the coming together of tech and surveillance and government and the totalitarian impulse, everything that you describe in this book, the beginnings of which we saw with COVID lockdowns and all that kind of thing, the completely manufactured nature of social distancing and masks and the ideology of that. And so you were labeled a right wing nut job if you opposed those kinds of mandates. So it immediately got politicized. But so I'm rambling now, but I want to move on to. It seems to me that one of the
Larry,
things that.
that was a good ramble.
Oh, okay, good.
No,
One
no,
of
No,
the.
no.
no,
I think
can,
I think you nailed it on the head. That's exactly the temptation. We need neither an ideological response to AI, which would be, reductively class or economic analysis. Uh, we need an approach that brings it all together and sees it as reflection of a much larger problem. And I think you summed up what that problem is very elegantly.
Very good. Paul, you want to say something?
um, one of Dan's many favorite sayings from Solzhenitsyn is uh, the exiguous middle path. So that's what Dan has tried to articulate all his life long and in this book, Ni l'un ni l'autre. Um, Larry, I've long been struck by how much you, I, and now we'll add Dan, we agree on so many of the features and the trends, and I'll say towards tyranny or despotism in the recent American landscape. So yeah, I've always, I would love at some point to maybe develop those thoughts together. One way we might be able to do it here is you basically just alluded to Shoshana LaBeouf's book, but also Rod Dreher's Live Not by Lies. Dan talks about Dreher's book. Maybe, we could talk about Dreher's analysis of that combination of, well, he calls it, surveillance capitalism and soft totalitarianism, as Dan likes to say, it's not so soft anymore. so, so
Yeah,
Yeah.
political philosophers of a certain type, meaning my type, for years for decades or more, have appealed to Alexis de Tocqueville's very prescient warnings about tutelary despotism or soft despotism, done to make life more convenient, taking away, as Tocqueville said, all the cares of living and thinking, you know. And we have to remember, social provision as a result of um, the business cycle or the fact that some people become permanently sick and infirm. I think charity, as Alexis de Tocqueville, a great critic of socialism, by the way, once said, uh, charity needs a social and a political dimension. I agree with that, but he said it shouldn't be socialism. It shouldn't be the omnicompetent state. So it's interesting that social provision. Winston Churchill introduced the modern, a capital C conservative introduced the modern welfare state in England around 1911 with social insurance and medical provision for the poor. Uh, but you know, the danger is the French call the welfare state the état-providence, the providential state. And that's the idea of the state sort of uh, uh, getting involved with pestiferous regulations and arbitrarily commanding certain things that have real no basis in anything other than the sort of technocratic mentality and sense of social control put forward by those in charge. And so, the idea that people might make risks with their freedom that might not please those who want a totally organized world. And Again, I warn Christians not to mistake that mixture of technocratic tyranny with the nanny state as somehow an application of Christian wisdom to the social sphere. It's something insidious, and it needs to be carefully distinguished from a prudential and principled concern for those who fall through the cracks, who
Yeah.
in a way
People
are not.
forget Dorothy Day opposed Social Security when it came out
I know.
on the
Can I say
grounds that
something about Dorothy Day, Larry? I was very struck. I didn't share her pacifism, and sometimes I thought she would say naive things about places like Cuba, but deep down, I think she was very anti-totalitarian. And I'll give you one example.
she was.
She responded in a very affective way to reading Solzhenitsyn. She was moved by her reading of Cancer Ward. She understood the deeper spiritual critique of totalitarianism, and I think the decentralized model that she put forward, Catholic worker communities, etc., owed something important to the church's teaching on subsidiarity,
Did.
um, um, which again, I hope Pope Leo recovers because, in a recent speech on the Day of the Poor, he talked about the rights to this, rights to this, rights to that. Okay, we can debate, the character of rights, but by doing to his credit, he defended the works of charity, which is something Francis didn't always do. In Fratelli Tutti, he says, in principle, this ought to all be done by the state, justice displacing charity. That's the problem. But I hope that that spirit of decentralization, of self-help, of communal organization and self-government tied to the spirit of fraternity and charity. I think that's something where there can be a real dialogue between an anti-totalitarian Catholic like myself and what Dorothy Day represented. So I think if she becomes a saint, the job is not, I think, to just sort of slavishly say, what would Dorothy Day do now? It's much more to take what's rich and enduring in her witness and contribution and to bring it into dialogue with there are many rooms in the Father's house, somebody said. And, Dorothy
Yeah.
Day is one of those rooms.
I also think though that the And thank you for that, because I agree with that. I think Dorothy is often misunderstood, mainly because she did say things like "God bless Castro" in some article she wrote in 1962 or something.
Yeah.
But the fact is, I sometimes think too, and it pertains to our earlier discussion. I sometimes think that this pitting of charity versus justice is in many ways a very non-Catholic way of forging the question, as if charity is this purely private thing that individuals do in the corporal and spiritual works of mercy, whereas justice is something the government does in broad egalitarian ways, addressing, the common good. And after all, it is the job of the government to address the common good, and that includes the economic common good, and I'm not arguing against that. Nevertheless, I don't think those are the only categories. When you're a political theorist, a political philosopher in many ways. When you look at the ecclesia, the church, as a corporate body, as an institution, as a force within history, she comprises within herself the coming together of charity and justice. In other words, in her corporate response to the evils and injustices of this world, all right, she, in a sense, creates a counter politics, a counter witness to that of the perennial conflict between private charity and government justice. I know my friend William Kavanaugh and others in the radical orthodoxy movement write about this kind of post-liberal Christian counter politics, if you will. And they, I think, agree with a great deal with many of the things that you write in this text about the culture of the lie, the distortions of the lie, and so forth. So, Paul, I'll turn it over to you after I give Dan a chance to respond to that.
Yeah, well, look, I do think one of the really problematic turns in elite Catholic opinion, and maybe in the emphases, Oral Colni has a beautiful phrase, misplaced emphases. It's not when someone's wrong, but where they emphasize some theme in a distorted way. And I think that's true with discussions of justice in later Catholic social teaching. Um, I've already mentioned the tendency, of course, there's a kind of formulaic bringing together of solidarity and subsidiarity, but it's often formulaic. Subsidiarity is paid lip service to, but is increasingly ignored in broader Catholic reflection. A justice is understood sometimes in a naive way. Human efforts at justice are always distorted by amour propre or human selfishness or will to power. Something we can learn by rereading uh, Reinhold Niebuhr on the complex relations between the legitimate and necessary search for justice, the law of love, and the reality of original sin. But I think if justice becomes the call to justice becomes an invitation for you know, uh, projects of coercion and social engineering or the common good
Right.
understood with collectivism. It's a trap. Um, One thing that disturbed me deeply about Pope Francis's encyclical Fratelli Tutti was the passages where he said, in principle, he didn't denounce Caritas. I don't think a Catholic Pope can denounce Caritas. But he said at the level of society and politics, in principle, all these responsibilities ought to be carried out by the state, as if the call to Caritas was an obstacle to a more just world. First of all, he completely ignored the deep wisdom that Pope Benedict had expressed on this subject in his great encyclical Deus et Caritas. But he also there was just a failure to think these two great things together. And there was a tendency of his papacy. Not only was there a tendency to think charity and justice to bring to allow charity and justice to drift apart, but, C.S. Lewis had said in his great essay, The Humanitarian Theory of Punishment, that what the humanitarian misses is that mercy and forgiveness and justice must kiss. And I don't think in this
Yeah.
pontificate we saw, I would add repentance, mercy,
Yeah.
justice, repentance. It's a trinity, a triunity. And so I think you're absolutely right that the call to love is not a call to sentimentality. It's not a call to the application of carefully crafted, carefully informed political and moral judgment, and nor is it a call toward collectivism. It's a call to it, Aristotle, way back in his Nicomachean Ethics, argued that the political human problem can't really be solved at the level of justice because every group will say this is just, this is just. The rich will have their view of justice, the poor will have their view. And Aristotle says in his Ethics that friendship allows people to, in a way, moderate their claims to justice, recognize we're in it together. Now, he called that concord, but that's not quite Christian caritas. But it's a reminder that at the level of justice, something is missing. And that something is the friendship and charity that moderates the zeal for remaking others in the world. And that's allow us to live together
Yeah.
in a certain comity. And so, again, and well, that's one of my themes too. I touch on it in the book and in The Idol of Her Age, but I wish the church spent less time uh, preoccupied with the recent thought of theologians and popes and drew more on the great tradition. There's so much there. In other words, Christian Catholic social doctrine will be enriched by an engagement with the great theologians and philosophers, classical and Christian, on these themes, not by, sort of just
I
endlessly repeating bromides from recent encyclicals.
Yeah, I think too the history of the monastic movement and the demise of the monastery. You look at the history of modern day Britain, you don't see the rise of poorhouses and debtor prisons and proposals for the welfare state until Henry VIII destroyed the monasteries. And in destroying the monasteries, he destroyed the best and most effective welfare system that the UK had, because the monks took care of the poor. But as soon as you got rid of the monks, then you had to deal with, well, what do we do with all these poor? And this is then this dynamic that then replays itself in various ways across, I think, the political spectrum in modern secular nation states as they're trying to grapple with, okay, what do we do about all these poor people? And then the ideological lie kicks in. When the supernatural is banished, then you've immanentized everything. Then the material dispossession of so many becomes an immanentized eschatological problem that you have to resolve somehow through some kind of very harsh means, if necessary. But anyway, another ramble from
Oh no,
me.
by the way, I read some years ago a beautifully crafted biography of Thomas More. So much modern Thomas More scholarship as Travis Curtright is influenced by these people who hate Thomas More. And, we have Hilary Mantel with her cult of Cromwell and all this, which I think is all nonsense. But Peter Ackroyd's biography of Thomas More, he points out that in terms of deeply grounded and felt piety, England was the most Catholic society in Europe
Yeah,
in the 50s. And Ackroyd compares what uh, Henry VIII did with the disestablishment of the church, but the war on the monasteries. He compares it to the Chinese Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, which is probably a little overwrought, but not completely overwrought. It was a revolution that, and you're absolutely right. I know something about this subject through my work on Tocqueville. Tocqueville was perplexed that England, the most prosperous country in the world, at the time he was writing two pieces called the Memoirs of Pauperism in the 1830s, also had in a way, it had a new form of poverty, the permanently dependent. And that arose from the poor laws. You're right. The hospital system, the works of charity carried out by the church and the monasteries was replaced by a kind of bureaucratized system that was shorn of caritas, that we're shorn of also of the call toward responsibility on the part of people. So I hope that the contemporary church knows how to combine a recognition of the public dimensions of charity with a continuing call to personal responsibility. And I will say there were two very promising moments in the recent address that Pope Leo XIV gave on World Day of the Poor. One was he said, and we didn't hear this much from Pope Francis, the greatest form of poverty is not to be in search of or in the presence of God. And the second thing he said is we should not underestimate the good that is achieved for human beings in society by the myriad acts of charity, and because if everything becomes the providential state, if the spiritual dimensions of human freedom and obligation are forgotten, we're in the name of the poor, the name of social provision, we're actually promoting a very unchristian view of the world, a
Yeah.
version of the ideological lie, so to speak.
Paul, you want to add to that?
Oh, I had a few thoughts, but
Go
I
ahead.
actually tried to think of there are two other aspects of Dan's book that we haven't talked about that probably is good
And
to
maybe
bring
we
up.
should get back to Dan's book.
No.
Oh, we've been in the interstices of the book. No,
Yeah,
That's
that's
right. We have all the
and, and,
ancillary questions. Go ahead,
and,
Paul.
absolutely.
and I will say, Dan and I have not had a talk about, ongoing developments with Leo the 14th. So I'm hearing about these things for the first time on your podcast, Larry. Okay. We've talked about ideology. During the course of his book, Dan kind of paints a general idea or, general ideal type of ideology. But he also discusses very different species, like identity politics or the 1619 Project or wokeness so it may or may not be helpful to kind of concretize the general by talking a little bit about, frankly, the American specific ones. We haven't had communist ideological totalitarianism here, but we've had wokeness. We had the ideology of identity politics. And if it hadn't been for the recent change of administration, we'd still be suffering under that, I think. One thing I will say about the book, it was basically written before the most recent election. So there's nothing in it about Trump or immigration or in any of the stuff that we're dealing with right now. So I'll just say the book, it's not dated.
Right.
But I think Dan pinned his acknowledgments June 7th, 2024. So, it's before the Trump administration, but he does survey a lot of American forms of ideology. Okay. Then this may help. This is the second thing. We touched a little bit about what's the relationship between ideology and modernity. Certainly it's connected somehow with technological science. Certainly it's connected with liberalism or capitalism, but how, and is it a direct continuous with it? Well, on one hand, ideology critique those two things. There's an enemy relationship there, and you can't just say one came from the first two. Although, you've had people on here and you probably are a little more inclined to identify ideological thinking with liberalism and capitalism than either Dan or I might, but that's a real issue. So I do think we need to talk about the different kinds of ideology, and then it turns out ideology has a list of enemies, and the presenting enemies are America, capitalism, liberalism, but then also it's Western Civ. Then it's the moral order, then it's also the created order, and then it's also God. And so, Dan has all of that enemy list in mind when he talks about ideology, because it's a thoroughgoing repudiation of America, of the liberal, democratic, capitalistic order, constitutional order we have, of Western Civ, okay, of the soul and of God. So he wants to defend all those, but he doesn't want to defend America, in the same way or to the same extent that he wants to defend the human soul or God. Okay,
Right,
so
right.
so those are two lists that I have in mind that are throughout Dan's book, different species of ideology, and then the hit list, and then he wants to defend the hit list, but in different ways.
Well,
Can
one
I,
thing,
before you answer, I want to piggyback on that and say, and one of the reasons why I think that we uniquely point towards the criticism of wokeism and the left and what the hit list, as you say, Paul, is precisely because the left has far more power than the right. And I know that's controversial to say, but in my opinion, it does. And I think Dan points this out: is the left is the religion of our culture. It operates it has captured all of the major institutions of our culture, even our corporate institutions, which normally are associated with more conservative, capitalist, rah-rah, sort of market economy kind of stuff. You see this capturing even of the corporate culture this is our religion in so many ways, and thus it does constitute the problem of our age. But anyway, so that's just to piggyback on what Paul said. And so, Dan, go ahead.
Well,
I
Larry,
think
Larry,
it's
Larry,
Wait,
yeah.
go ahead, Paul.
Once again, I think that there are points of agreement between the three of us that I sense, and at some point I'd love to, just a survey of the contemporary world might be
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we would have. Okay, now, Dan, go ahead.
oh, yes, I think that uh, I think that the present situation is marked by a paradox, which I think Larry alluded to, which is on the one hand, as happens from time to time, it happened in the 80s with the presidency of Ronald Reagan, or followed by George Bush or Margaret Thatcher in Europe. You often have conservative parties that win elections, but as I say at one point in the book, the revolution proceeds. And part of that had to do with the naive economism of many conservative parties. They thought, as long as we had a growth economy, economic prosperity, there would be occasional bow, sometimes using silly and lazy language like family values to the cultural issues. Uh, but there would be a that all went hand in hand with the continued self-radicalization of civil society. One of the problems with the new totalitarian impulse. Notice in my book I speak about a totalitarian impulse. I don't want to say we live under totalitarian regimes, but we live under free or somewhat free regimes that are infected by an ideological virus and a totalitarian temptation. And I think that's very real. Um, but in my adult lifetime, I began teaching full time in 1986. I retired from Assumption in 2021. I retired from Assumption in part because I had to. The climate had become unacceptable in terms of teaching. My department was under assault. A sane president of the college was going on about structural racism without knowing what it meant. The college was under pressure to make accommodations. A Roman Catholic college that wasn't a habitually mad one, felt under pressure to make accommodations to gender ideology, et cetera, et cetera. And there was very little resistance, let's say, in the summer of 2020. There was an atmosphere that something dramatic was changing and that people of goodwill were being steamrolled by the ideologists. And, people are fighting back now, but Larry's right that the left and the secular religion associated with it, the mix of progressivism, autonomy, a denial of classic Christian anthropology in the form of gender theory, the new racism, which is, I think, more insidious than the old racism because it claims not to be racist, even as it puts forward a radical denial of common humanity and common moral responsibility. I'll get to that in a minute. So, I do think that many of us noticed. I mean, I noticed all this stuff 40 years ago, but many of my colleagues noticed that their children, or many of my friends noticed their children were graduating from college. They weren't going out into the real world, that was somehow free from ideological corruption. They were going out, people were graduating, and they were reinforcing that leftist secular religion that Larry referred to. How did the New York Times go from being a classic liberal paper, and sometimes a dumb liberal paper, but a liberal paper, into a paper that apologized for left-wing violence, that showed naivete about Hamas, that started praising communism, not that they want to go back to Stalin, but communism's on the right side of it. All this madness, the new racialism. Well, people graduated from elite colleges and they got jobs in the New York Times newsroom and editorial departments, and the demarcation between the real world and the commanding heights of the bien pensant was erased. And that's still our problem. I mean, I think there's fierce resistance in those institutions on the ideological activist wing of the culture to common sense. And yes, that does lead to the danger of radicalization in those who resist the ideological lie. That's why I say at the end of my book, resist but don't emulate. And I, I, there's a very careful thread that I follow near the end of the book where I say, my book and my broad political philosophical perspective is rooted in classical moderation. On the other hand, in an age of ideology and ideological mendacity, one needs to fiercely, in the name of authentic moderation and balance, needs to fiercely resist the ideological temptation. And I do take aim at faux moderation. What is faux moderation? The people who say, well, abortion on demand is part of the culture, gender ideology, people in polite society believe in it. You just have to accommodate yourself to these developments that are treated as irreversible a few years later. And therefore you're still in. Well, that isn't moderation.
Yeah,
Moderation is not the geographical center. Moderation is a quality of soul and judgment that resists, you might say, the extremism of the Revolutionary Party and the nostalgic illusions of the reactionary party. So I take aim at faux moderation while defending true moderation. And I warn in my final chapter, I warn those who resist, let's say, the new racism. Don't do so in the name of white racism. Do so in the name of authentic human equality. Um, resist not Do not be tempted by a new paganism or a post.
yeah.
I'm a big fan of the black writer Shelby Steele, who was warning against identity politics way back in the 1980s. But he made the point very powerfully in a series of books. If you tell young people that there is no right and wrong, that everything is will to power. And at the same time, you tell, let's say, young white men that they're ontologically evil, ontologically guilty. Eventually, they're gonna fight back, but they're not gonna do so in the name of the old truths of our civilization, or let's say
Right.
our founding. They're gonna do so in the name of a rival identity politics. I am not an advocate of a rival identity politics. I'm a scourge of all identity politics because we cannot reduce human beings to skin pigmentation. We cannot deny. One of the worst things that happened in the summer of 2020 was it became verboten to say all lives matter. Black lives matter because all lives matter. And you know that Maoist cult, that anti-Christian cult BLM that so many, I think otherwise decent people fell for. You know, what a shame, what a scandal. Remember the BLM people in Minnesota marching and they said white
Yeah,
people in a
yeah,
blanket, burn, burn. What does that have to do with justice, racial or otherwise? So these stuff, Paul's right. These things are really important. And I would say an issue that's of the deepest importance for me, I touch upon it in the book, although it doesn't have the same importance in length of treatment like I do with the post-colonialists who have a very naive view of human history and see the West as unremittingly guilty. Come fix your eye upon me, I thirst for accusation, said Yeats in 1925. Or the new racism, which I think is pernicious of the common good and is informed a new form of racism. But I think gender theory. If the church, for example, continues to accommodate the LGBTQ plus activists and gender theory, they are making a pact with the devil because the denial of a common human nature, the denial of the human complementarity of male and female, affirmed right at the beginning of the book of Genesis, the teaching of young people that they're fluid and can adopt 73 or 173 different self-definitions of their humanity and
yeah.
sex. This is another term I like to resort to. Burke, when he spoke about the atheism by establishment of the Jacobins, he called it metaphysical madness. The church and other people of new goodwill can't just have a dialogue with the activists and the loudest voices. We cause scandal. We do not say in the most forthright way that this view of humanity is poisonous and destructive. It is certainly one of the forms, most pernicious forms that the ideological lie takes today. And I think I hope we hear more about that from him. We heard, you know, I mean, look, I was in Budapest teaching in the spring of 2023 when Pope Francis visited Hungary. He gave a very good speech while I was there about gender theory as a form of ideological colonization. 2 days later, he flew back to Rome and he met Father Martin and that English nun who
I
pushes
know.
gender. And I thought to myself, does anything cause more confusion and scandal than, Christ says a house divided cannot stand, you know? Well, that's a house divided when you're,
Yeah. I
yeah,
spoke of the performative contradiction at the heart of the Francis papacy. And to me, it was an incoherent papacy on that level, on those limited issues. It
Larry,
was
do you think he believed what he said in Budapest before?
yeah, I think he did. I because he repeated it. In other words, I'm not willing to go down the rabbit hole of saying the Pope that Pope Francis was just a liar, that he was trying to deceive the world, that he was orthodox and all that through his words, all the while through his actions, he was undermining all of that. That would entail a level of conniving and deception that I'm just, out of charity for the dead and out of charity for the office of Peter, I'm not willing to go down the road because there's no strong evidence that he himself wasn't simply just inconsistent and incoherent and all over the map and of two minds, maybe even.
Well, by the way, I'll give you two more. I tend to agree with you. I'll give you two more examples. The Pope would occasionally and even eloquently say the church is not an NGO. But the
Right.
rest of the time, he acted as if he was the left wing chairman of a left wing NGO. He also would, from time to time, invoke the book by Benson, A Lord of the World,
Yeah.
which is the Anglophone version of Vladimir Solovyev's Tale of the Antichrist, which warns about a kind of humanitarian, the most
Exactly.
And yet he loved that book, and yet in so many ways his judgments and words reinforced the very position condemned in Benson's book. So I think the inconsistencies are so grave that they do not suggest Machiavellian duplicity. They suggest a pope. This may be too much for some people, but I said it's not like you go searching for which heresy Francis believed in. I think he was half Catholic and half humanitarian. I think the two impulses in his
Yeah.
soul were there up front and were the sources. And again, to relate this to my book, John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI each had their own idiom and emphases, but both of them were self-consciously aware of two things. The threat that the religion of humanity posed to an authentic Catholic theological, moral, and political witness, and they both knew the grave evil of totalitarianism.
They
I
did.
do I do not think Francis understood either of those things.
Yeah, and I'll get to Paul in a second because I know he has a contribution to make. I have an article coming out soon, at least I hope, in the Pillar, where I point out that those internal contradictions in Pope Francis actually mirror the tensions in Vatican II, especially at Gaudium et Spes, between ressourcement thinkers who are more Christocentric, like Wojtyła, Ratzinger, de Lubac, and ressourcement thinkers like Skillebeck and others that were more globalist, more Ranerian, more God is always already reconciled to the always already engraced world. And those two ruptures lead to concilium and communio and are the source of the great tension in the church. So John Paul and Benedict, of course, go with the communio Lubacian GS 22, a sort of affirmation of Christological anthropology. Francis has both of those tensions living within himself in this completely unresolved way that just shows up as something all over the map. That's my take. So I agree with you, Dan. But Paul, you wanted to say something earlier. I saw you
Well,
motioning.
no,
You're too
very,
polite, Paul. You should just interrupt like I do.
no. That's very incisive. I actually look forward to it. Hell, I may even subscribe to Pillar just for you. um,
It's
uh,
pretty good, Paul.
this might be an appropriate ending topic. Um, Satan is the father of lies. Ideology is the great lie. Solzhenitsyn used the phrase. I think we need to gesture towards some connections between Satan and the demonic and ideology, understood as anti-man or humanity, anti-God. Now, ever since abortion on demand, that's a direct assault on the human. And then we have same-sex marriage, then we have gender ideology. Humanity is taking a beating emanating from Western elites and Western thoughts and ideologies. Now, it also was over in Russia, in Cuba, but the West has engendered this terrible thing called ideology, which, claims to be just, claims to be emancipatory, but as Dan said earlier, it enslaves man and it kills man.
It enslaves man because, and I'll let Dan respond,
No,
but something I want to add on to
but
that.
I do want to raise.
Go ahead, Paul.
I just want to raise the issue. It's so anti-human. I do want to say it looks like the devil's at work. Now you don't want to start there. I don't, but I do want to. And I like George Orwell, when he was trying to understand communism, he was forced to use Christian theological categories just to describe the phenomenon that he was observing. He was not a believer, but theology gave him the language for the extreme of evil and anti-humanness that he was observing. So go ahead.
Yeah, and that was in your summary, and I was glad to be reminded of that Orwell did that. But to piggyback on that, and then we'll have Dan respond. In a lot of this, I'm reminded of the philosophy of the late, great Italian philosopher Augusto Del Noce, who pointed to the fact that, like in academic philosophy, since Feuerbach and others, you end up with this periodization of history where humanity is portrayed as an organism that goes from infancy into adulthood. And then all of history is kind of the unfolding of this movement from myth to religion, superstition, myth, religion, then philosophy, and on into modern science. And so now it's like Fukuyama on steroids. There is a point to history, and it's us. Okay. And Del Noce says, therefore, this is the dogma of our time that we have to acidically eat away at everything that came before because we have now arrived. And he says, the great mantra, the great dogma of our age can be summarized in the phrase, we can no longer believe the following, meaning we're going to repeat. And this pointed to something earlier we said in our conversation. There is this parasitical quality to the ideological lie, whereas it is a distortion of something good. But once it so distorts it that it kills it, there has to be a new goad against which to kick. There has to be a new target. And so the line of progress and justice and so forth grows ever wider to the point now the great liberating moment is we have to prove that women can have penises and men menstruate. All right, which we have reached a brink of irrationality, which I think Chesterton predicted a long time ago. It's a level of madness that we've reached. Anyway, based on what Paul just said, go ahead, Paul, add on to that.
And Dan will appreciate this. Peggy, he characterized modernity as parasitism.
Very good. That's right.
Well, by the way, you both said very important things. Roger Scruton has a book, not his most famous book, called Modern Culture. And near the end of the book, he has two chapters on the ideology of deconstruction and transgression. And he sort of sums up that postmodernist nihilism in about 14 points. But he calls the chapter in the book The Devil's Work. And Scruton liked to quote a line from Goethe's Faust, where Goethe defines Mephistopheles as the spirit who forever negates. And this is a spirit of negation. The spirit of negation is the spirit of, and it is not constructive. It is not something that builds. One of Chesterton's great points was the self-contradictory character of revolutionary and nihilistic approaches because they draw on the very categories, truth, wisdom, virtue, that they negate in principle. And so, and that's why, as Alain Besançon says, they end up using homonyms. They end up changing the meaning of peace, of justice, the common good, virtue and vice after a while just get thrown out the window as being too traditional. So I think Paul's absolutely right. And he's right that the problem of evil necessarily raised itself or came to the forefront in examining 20th century totalitarianism. And that's why I think the deepest critics of the totalitarian impulse and totalitarian theory and practice were not liberal ones. There were certainly honorable liberals who were anti-communist and anti-Nazi, but often that defense of freedom against totalitarianism would be done in the name of, individual rights, human rights, not I'm not denouncing human rights, but human rights can become ideological in their own way. They can avoid the sort of self-limitation that is necessary to give them civilized form and expression. And so, I think of someone like Isaiah Berlin, the English philosopher. His lesson from totalitarianism was we have to avoid truth with a capital T. We have to avoid monism. Richard Rorty, the postmodern English professor, used to say that we have to recognize that all these appeals to justice and human rights are metaphorical, that they have no metaphysical status, that He wrote an article in 1990 in the New Republic. It was a review essay on writings by Jan Patočka, the Central European phenomenologist and philosopher who had such an important impact on Václav Havel and who died under interrogation from the Czech STB when he was a member of Charter 77. In any case, Rorty said, well, living in truth. Well, I understand why they use that language, but come on, it's just a metaphor. You know,
Yeah.
if you are unable to affirm a meaningful distinction between truth, falsehood, good and evil, you have entered into the devil's work. I'm not saying Isaiah Berlin, who was an honorable man who stood up to bad things, was even a pernicious figure, but I think there was something inadequate about a liberalism that was tepid in recurring to the necessary distinctions between truth, falsehood, good, evil. And that's why I think people like Besançon, Pierre Manon, Del Noce are so important for Catholic renewal because they confronted the totalitarian phenomenon up front. They did not make the kind of crucial concessions that led one to half endorse the ideology of progress. Del Noce is so interesting because not only was he among one of the great learned Catholic critics of the totalitarian impulse, but he did something that very few people did. He tied it to the sexual nihilism
Yes.
of modern time. And he did that in a very rich and compelling way. These were not just two separate, with the New Left in the 60s, the assault on the human sexual order uh, regime, constitution, and the assault on authority went hand in hand. And by the way, we Christians, we need to talk a little less about human rights, and we need to recover the notion of authority, not authoritarianism, true authority, authoritative institutions. The church ought to be an authoritative institution that speaks the truth about man. Contemporary popes say, we listen, we listen. Jesus didn't begin his ministry by listening. He began by saying, repent, the kingdom of God is at hand.
That's right.
We need a little more truth telling and a little less dialogue with the
When the rich young man walked away, the rich young ruler, walked away from Jesus, he didn't say, wait, you misunderstand. Let me accompany you. Don't run off to the peripheries. Come back, come back. No,
yeah.
he said, well, there he goes. That's what happens when you're rich. He's probably going to go to hell. I mean, I'm paraphrasing Jesus, but he uses that occasion to turn to the crowd and say, this is why it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to. You cannot serve both God and money and so on and so forth. So
And by the
yeah,
way,
you're
I think it was John Paul II who issued an encyclical whose name escapes me in 1984 about sin, and where he said very directly, the sin of the modern world is the denial of sin. And
yeah.
we cannot have a meaningful account of the human condition, the human person, that does not begin with the fact that sin is a palpable reality and repentance is the necessary path for the healing and elevation of souls.
Perhaps we can end with this then, because we've been at this about an hour and a half. I'm very encouraged by the fact we now have an Augustinian pope, and I'm assuming that his theology is Augustinian, along the lines of obviously there are elements of Augustine I don't agree with, nor does the church. But Augustine certainly had a keen sense of sin, as you were just pointing out.
Yep.
Everything, we're talking about the distinction between city of God and city of man that cuts right through the human heart. It sounded like, a presaging of Solzhenitsyn in so many ways. But here's the thing. I hope what Pope Leo retrieves along these lines is a proper eschatological sense of how sin has wounded us, how everything in this life is penultimate, leading to more ultimate things. Because it seems to me the divide in Catholic theology that I was speaking of before, Sarah Shortall makes this point in her book, Soldiers of God, is a kind of divide between a kind of liberal Thomistic incarnationalism devoid of a real sense of the fall, devoid of a real sense of sin, which then turns into this global thing. That versus the De Lubacian Wojtyłan greater emphasis on Augustine and sin and eschatology. So a runaway prelapsarian incarnationalism, in a sense, versus a more sober eschatological analysis. But anyway, I'll let you comment on that, and then we can.
Well, I would say the liberal Thomist globalism, a distortion of Thomas, and probably
Well, it is.
we need Thomas and Augustine together, but on the whole, I endorse your sentiment. And look, you used an interesting phrase before. You talked about the acidic character of modernity. There's actually it was a 1929 book by the public philosopher Walter Lippmann. He talked about the acids of modernity, and this is where I think ideology or the ideological lie takes there's already this acidic character of modernity, this kind of weakening of the moral contents of life, broadly understood. Ideology radicalizes it in a way where, the way I would put it, we almost become inarticulate. We lose the language and categories that allow us to have self knowledge, to allow us to
Yes.
live in the world together. And when John Paul II used to speak, he wasn't the first. Pascal and Peggy and others used this phrase, but about the Paul VI spoke about humanity, the church being an expert in humanity. John Paul II talked about the truth about man. I think that points to the positive alternative to the ideological lie, which is the recovery of the truth about man. That's linked to
Truth.
the truth. And by the way, the great task of theology, political philosophy, um, even just simply, high-minded civic engagement is today, is to reconnect truth and liberty. Now, that's going to involve a lot
Right.
of difficulties and tensions, and we're going to need all the resources of the tradition to do so. But modernity without restraint is all about separating liberty from truth and human nature. I'll quote Pope Benedict, 2011, his speech to the speech of the Bundestag, and he was talking to Germans who were, ecology is almost a secular religion or is a secular religion. He said, okay, it's good that we're paying attention to the ecological order, but man also has an ecology, a
Oh,
moral ecology, a human nature. We got to recover that. And I think they're not only they're wonderful resources for doing so, and I try to draw on many of them, including the Russian witnesses, Dostoevsky and Solzhenitsyn, but their wisdom is in continuity with the broader wisdom that the Christian and Western world have. We have so many ample resources to move forward, to overcome the ideological lie. And it's almost as if there's a willful refusal to draw on that wisdom.
there
You know,
is.
kind of Maritain put it so well on the Paysan de la Garonne in 1965. He says, instead of a self respecting assertion of old truths and a meaningful dialogue with the modern world, we're kneeling before the world.
He
And
was
we
so
must-
right. You know, it's
yeah.
interesting. We keep going here. It's so long, but it's so interesting. Paul, I'm going to give you a chance to speak too here at the end. But you mentioned Walter Lippmann, and I think he's pertinent. I used to teach courses in the mass media, and I used Walter Lippmann. And one of the more interesting things he points out is that the real role in our democracy of a journalist, a proper journalist,
Yeah.
is to play the role of the intermediary between the world of the academics and the politicians and the leaders and the common person. And he said the common person thinks with images in their heads. And therefore, the journalist has to provide the common people with accurate, proper images in their heads. But if you're beholden to the ideological lie, which is what the modern media journal, I mean, we don't have journalism anymore. What we have are sophisticated image generating machines to put images in our heads that are in fact lies and are distorting. Then you have a fundamental violation of Walter Lippmann's basic principle of what a journalist should be.
And we have, and this is a phrase I recur to over and over in the book, we have this omnipresent tyranny of ideological cliches. It's not all that different from the langue de bois, the wooden language that totalitarians use. And when you hear too much of that, you know you're dwelling in a realm of untruth. Because those cliches don't mean anything. They're literally vacuous.
Yeah, like no kings. We had that protest the
Yeah,
other
yeah,
day.
yeah, yeah.
And that's interesting because, and I want to clarify something I said about COVID earlier, lest people I'm not here, I'm not an epidemiologist or a virologist. I don't know anything about vaccines or the source of the virus. My concern is with the social control that was exercised by government, which I thought was overreaching. And in that
And
regard,
ungrounded in the very science they appeal to.
yeah, exactly. So in that regard, my primary concern in all of this is the slowly squeezing web of our own making, as Anton Barbiquet puts it, that is squeezing all around us. And I think this is unbelievably important, the realm of the lie, the realm of AI hallucinations. All of this is something that the church desperately needs to deal with. Paul, go ahead.
Just with respect to the last point, with which I agree, of course. Um, One could read Aaron Kheriaty's book, The New Abnormal, for a holistic analysis of that situation. Um, yeah, I was thinking earlier you were saying, incarnational Thomas, and then more appropriate to our times, Augustinianisms. Don't forget Pascal.
Oh yeah. And we'll be talking about him, I hope, when we discuss Manent's new book.
That was my lead to that. But he was closer to Augustine than he was Thomas, but he had a distinctive inflection. And I always think it's whenever you have, conflicting disputes, and both are legitimate, it's nice to have a third voice who's neither one or the other, and he allows a new light on both parties. So Pascal, because he's one of those who was at the birth of modernity, and he really thought that both the truth about man and the truth of the Christian religion were threatened directly, explicitly, and insidiously by modernity. So,
I
so
agree. And I think, oh, I remember too what I wanted to say about no kings. I'm not a huge Trumper or anything like that, but there's a sense in which the lie of the left of wokeness is subtle. It's insidious. It permeates into us. So we don't recognize it for it's easy to recognize because we live in the post-Hitler age of Nuremberg. That's what evil looks like. Evil looks like Gestapo. Evil looks like Nuremberg. And so it's easy to say down with Trump because of ICE, because of deportations, because of police presence in the streets. And so that's fascism at play. And yet, where were these same voices when the Biden administration was exercising the greatest repression of civil rights in the United States since the Civil War? Where were those protests then? When in my state, Governor Wolf, with the stroke of a pen because of emergency declaration, could shut down churches and schools and corporations and the whole nine yards. Where was the no kings mantra then? So you spoke, Dan, about the constant proliferation of these mantras, these memes, these slogans. All right, well, just no kings is a slogan. What does it really mean? And where were you 4 years ago? Okay, when school kids were being kicked out of schools and so on. But anyway, I'm on a rant now, Paul.
no, rant on. Larry or Dan, do you guys see any evidence that the church hierarchy has learned from its submission during the COVID lockdowns and allowing secular authority to say you're not essential, and that to be a good citizen, you have to forego your religious duties? See, that seems to me to be, Pierre Menard talks about moral wounds. For example, after the collapse of communism, he says Europe by and large did not engage in a reflection on the truth and reality of communism, and that's led to a rebirth of ideology in a humanitarian way in Europe. So I think we need to take these opportunities to reflect on the lessons of. So I think the church, especially hierarchy, the Catholic Church, really needs to reflect and repent of its submission to Caesar. So do
I
you see
think there
any?
are many lay and even clerical voices who have drawn the proper conclusions, but one doesn't see evidence of leadership or deep reflection on this coming from the bishops or from Rome. I would also add it was not only the accommodation to secular authority dominated by this technocratic scientism, it was the church's own um, succumbing to the religion of self-preservation, of health-mindedness, that, well, if there's any threat to people, we can't worship, or priests can't go, or, we can't minister to the sick in hospitals. Read Manzini's Betrothed, and during the time of the plagues, priests who ministered to souls, and then look at a church that frankly was just a little too willing to accept the claim that not being sick or physical health is the great desiderata. And that's a deeper change of orientation, very far from the spirit of martyrdom, I would say.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with all of that. But let me play devil's advocate here. Father Thomas Joseph White, no liberal, just came out with a piece defending the church's sort of shutting down and saying, look, in the interest of public safety and public health. I agree with you. If it's simply an acquiescence and an accommodation to secular authority, oh, the government says this, therefore we have to shut down. But you know, I think our church decided that COVID was enough of a public health threat that it warranted the closing of churches and so forth. But I think I have more resonance with your statement, Dan, about priests being willing to risk, maybe we're not going to have mass with 1,000 people all gathered together in a church, but a priest ought to be able to go and visit a nursing home or go into a hospital and minister to the sick. And the church really didn't make much of a stink about those kinds of restrictions. And so I agree with you completely in that regard.
Yeah, by the way, I agree with you and Father White. I think a good case could be made that public worship with hundreds of people could have been dangerous, might have had deleterious consequences, not just on the physical plane. I understand all that, but it's the safetyism, it's the ethic of
Yeah.
self-preservation among clergy, the failure to do the corporal works of mercy and other
Yes.
works of mercy. Those can never be suspended. And if they are suspended, you are leaving a Christian horizon or moral universe.
Yes. Anyway, Paul, you wanted to say something, and we really probably should close this up.
I, I deliberately said reflection because I think we know much more about that period now than initially the church leaders did. So I'm willing to give them some slack for the first
Yeah,
year, maybe. But what we know now is if they allow it to happen again, they will have capitulated to Caesar and to this new ethic of humanitarian health.
I agree with that. I agree with that. Anyway, we
Yeah.
have now been at this about an hour, almost 2 hours. Oh my goodness. This might go down as the longest podcast of Gaudium et Spes 22 history. Dan, I'll give Dan the last word. Any last thoughts, Dan, before we sign off?
Well, in the course of our conversation today, I was struck that so many of the themes that I sketch in The Persistence of the Ideological Lie touch on themes that I had dealt with in The Idol of Our Age. These are
Yes.
humanitarianism, this sort of reduction of the fullness of truth to a kind of this worldly humanitarianism. It's another manifestation of the ideological lie, and one that has a great effect on the self-understanding and public role of the church. But all of it comes back to the willingness of of thoughtful human beings, believers and unbelievers, to renew the age-old human search for truth. And I think if we understand liberty simply as doing what we will, if we relativize conscience, if we suspend the moral law, if we affirm human autonomy, rather than emancipating human beings, we're enslaving them. And, in my book, I try to highlight the various public and intellectual forms that self enslavement takes. But underneath it all is a positive vision where liberty and truth are reconnected, where the truth about man can become not. I couldn't agree more with Pope John Paul II when he said our job is to persuade. We're not in the business of forcing um, um, the truth on people. But on the other hand, we have to put forward the truth about man as genuinely authoritative, not as just, one value among others, but the
Exactly.
the key to to lives well lived, individually and collectively, as I said before. And so anyway, having done one on the idol of age and this, I'm just thinking about how it's all part of this larger field of issues, and uh, um, and just insist to the listeners that um, our emphasis is ultimately not on the negation of the spirit of negation, although that's necessary practically, but that finally entails a willingness to open the human soul again to the claims of truth.
Absolute great way to sum up. And I certainly read your latest book as in continuity with the major themes of the idols of the age. And Paul, thank you first for your summary you sent us the other day. That was fantastic. It really helped guide my own thoughts about the book. It's been a while now. It's been almost a month since I read the book on the airplane going to Rome. At any rate, and thank you, Dr. Mahoney, for being here today.
Oh, this was great. This was illuminating and great fun. And this is what, there's something joyful and liberating about real human conversation. And we had it today.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you so much. And thanks everybody for listening. Bye now.